This episode, Theology and Prophecy, Inside the Iran-Israel-U.S. Conflict from the Sovereign Drift series, is brought to you by Viscard Studio.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are stepping into a really comprehensive exploration of what's undoubtedly the most complex and rapidly escalating conflict on the global stage right now.
Absolutely.
We're looking at the intense military and, frankly, ideological collision between Israel, the United States, and Iran, and we're focusing specifically on those cascading events of 2025 and early 2026. So we're thrilled to have you here with us. We really want you to feel like you are sitting right at the table with us as an active participant in this conversation.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenal stack of materials we have to go through today. I mean, this isn't just a surface level news summary for you. We're unpacking an incredibly dense topic, and we're going to take the time to really examine the machinery underneath the headlines.
Exactly. And to do that, we are pulling from a truly massive array of sources. We've got highly detailed military battle damage assessments from groups like the Institute for Science and International Security. We're looking at geopolitical policy briefs.
The ones from the European Council on Foreign Relations, right?
Yeah, right. And the Klingendale Institute. Plus, we have historical and academic analyses of Zionist ideology. We've got recent on-the-ground news dispatches, and perhaps most uniquely, we have this fascinating collection of theological commentaries that actually explore ancient prophecies in relation to today's military deployments.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
But that variety of information requires a very specific approach from us, especially given the gravity of the subject matter.
It does. And that brings us to a crucial disclaimer for you, the listener. The sources we are diving into today contain highly politically and religiously charged content. And this is from multiple deeply opposed sides of this conflict. So our mission today is not to endorse any specific viewpoint. We are not here to validate any claim, nor are we taking any political or theological side.
Right.
Instead, our goal is strict epistemological neutrality. We are here to impartially report on the perspectives presented in the source material. We're going to map out the landscape of ideas, the military strategies, the historical claims, the religious doctrine, so that you can just understand the underlying drivers of this conflict.
And that framework is totally essential, because what the geopolitical briefs and the theological texts collectively suggest is that this conflict is not just about missile defense systems, or centrifuge capabilities, or even the price of crude oil. The documents frame this as a massive historical collision. We have multi-decade geopolitical strategies crashing head-on into ancient theological worldviews, and together these forces are actively reshaping the modern international order as we speak.
So to really grasp how we arrived at the massive escalations of 2025 and 2026, the historical assessments in our stack suggest we have to start by looking at what analysts call the shadow war. Because for decades, the baseline assumption was that while Israel and Iran were fierce adversaries, they would avoid direct, massive military strikes on each other's soil.
Yeah, that's the clear consensus in the historical literature. The sources state that since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's foreign policy has been heavily framed around anti-Zionism and pan-Islamic solidarity. But instead of conventional state-on-state warfare, the strategic documents describe Iran utilizing a vast network of proxy forces.
Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen.
Exactly. The texts define it as a strategy of asymmetric pressure.
But our sources point to a massive paradigm shift. The policy briefs claim that this long-standing deterrence fundamentally broke down after the events of October 2023. Following the Hamas attacks, the documents note that Israel adopted a highly militarized approach across the entire region. The geopolitical briefs refer to a historical Israeli military doctrine known as mowing the grass. And I think we should pause and explain what that actually means in this context, because it sounds almost casual, but the reality is...
It's anything but casual. It's a very specific strategic term. The analyses explain mowing the grass as a doctrine based on the assumption that certain threats cannot be permanently solved through diplomacy, or even a decisive final war. Instead, the military must periodically conduct severe targeted operations to degrade the enemy's capabilities. The texts use the analogy of a lawn that constantly grows back. You can't stop the grass from growing, but you can routinely cut it down to a manageable level so it doesn't overtake the yard. So after October 2023, the European Council on Foreign Relations brief notes that Israel took this doctrine to an unprecedented level, systematically targeting the leadership and infrastructure of what Iran calls the axis of resistance.
And the literature suggests that this aggressive degradation of proxy forces essentially removed the buffer zone between Israel and Iran, setting the stage for direct confrontation. Which brings us to June 2025. The military assessments refer to this as the 12-day war. This is a critical anchor point in our sources.
It really is. The documents detail two concurrent massive operations. You have Israel's Operation Rising Lion and the United States Operation Midnight Hammer. According to the Pentagon and intelligence assessments in our stack, the U.S. and Israel launched precision strikes directly onto Iranian soil, specifically targeting their nuclear infrastructure.
And the level of detail in these battle damage assessments from the Institute for Science and International Security is just staggering. They don't just say, nuclear sites were hit. They map out the specific architecture of the Iranian nuclear program. For instance, the strikes targeted the Natanz nuclear complex. The reports describe Natanz as the absolute workhorse of Iran's enrichment program, noting it houses over 18,000 centrifuges in these massive underground halls.
Let's actually break that down for the listener. When the sources talk about 18,000 centrifuges, what are we practically looking at according to the science briefs?
Well, the briefs describe a centrifuge as a highly sophisticated, incredibly fast spinning cylinder. You think of a salad spinner that uses centrifugal force to push water away from the lettuce. The reports explain a uranium centrifuge does something similar, but at a molecular level. It spins uranium hexafluoride gas at supersonic speeds to separate the heavier uranium-238 isotopes from the lighter uranium-235 isotopes.
And the uranium-235 is what you need for a nuclear reaction.
Exactly. And the documents emphasize that destroying these arrays is incredibly difficult because they're housed in reinforced subterranean facilities.
Right. And Natanz wasn't the only target the reports mention. The assessments state they also hit the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, which is famously buried deep inside a mountain, the IR-40 Arak heavy water reactor, and the Esfahan Nuclear Technology Center. The sources specifically mention Esfahan handles uranium metal conversion.
Why does the Institute for Science and International Security highlight that specific process?
Because, according to their technical assessments, uranium metal conversion is the crucial bridge between having enriched nuclear material and actually building a weapon. The science briefs explain you can have all the enriched uranium gas in the world, but to make the core of a nuclear warhead, you have to convert that gas into solid uranium metal.
So if the centrifuges are milling the flour...
The metal conversion plant is where you're actually baking the bread. Taking the Esfahan facility offline, according to the military briefs, was a massive blow to the weaponization timeline.
To achieve that kind of destruction on facilities buried under mountains, the documents outline a massive deployment of firepower. The U.S. reportedly utilized B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, dropping GBU-57, massive ordnance penetrator weapons. The reports literally refer to these as bunker busters.
The physics of those weapons, as described in the defense briefings, are wild.
Yeah, they don't explode on impact. The reports explain they're designed to use pure kinetic energy and extreme weight to punch through up to 200 feet of solid earth and reinforced concrete before a delayed fuse triggers the warhead.
And as for the impact of this operation, the Pentagon assessments claim these June 2025 strikes were highly successful in the short term. They reportedly physically destroyed the centrifuge halls and set the Iranian nuclear program back by 1 to 2 years. However, the exact same battle damage reports document a ferocious and immediate retaliation.
The 12-day war wasn't one-sided.
It's not at all. The analyses state that Iran launched unprecedented waves of ballistic missiles directly at Israel, and these weren't proxy strikes. The reports indicate these salvos successfully saturated and breached advanced air defense systems with significant impacts recorded at military sites and, notably, the massive oil refinery in Haifa.
Which means the decades-long deterrence was fully shattered. And the news dispatches in our stack show that this 12-day war was just a prelude to an even more dramatic escalation that occurred in February and March of 2026. This is referred to in the defense documents as Operation Epic Fury.
And the stated objectives here, according to U.S. and Israeli sources, completely shifted.
Right. This was no longer just about taking out centrifuges. The documents claim this joint operation utilizing Tomahawk cruise missiles, F-18s, F-35 stealth fighters, and swarms of single-use drones was explicitly aimed at regime change.
The transition from degrading military infrastructure to active decapitation strikes is a massive leap in the geopolitical literature. The reported casualties from this spring 2026 operation are staggering. News sources in our stack, which include aggregations from Reuters as well as statements from Iranian state media, report the deaths of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with several high-ranking members of the clerical regime.
The documents specifically list Defense Minister Amir Naseerzadeh and the powerful Revolutionary Guard's ground force commander Mohammad Pakpour as having been killed in these strikes. Furthermore, the reports note the deaths of Khamenei's daughter, grandchild, and other family members.
The psychological and political shockwave of taking out the supreme leader cannot be overstated in these reports, and they detail that Iran's counterstrikes expanded the map of the war entirely. They didn't just fire back at Israel. The intelligence briefs document that Iranian ballistic missiles struck U.S. military installations housed in supposedly neutral Gulf states.
The documents specify impacts at the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, the Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, the massive Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and the Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates.
So we have to ask, based on the geopolitical analyses provided, why did this historic shift happen exactly when it did? Why did the U.S. and Israel decide that 2025 and 2026 were the moments to launch strikes that previous administrations had actively avoided for decades?
Well, the geopolitical briefs offer a very clear two-pronged rationale for this strategy. First, as we discussed with the mowing the grass concept, they suggest Israel felt emboldened because Iran's axis of resistance had been severely degraded throughout 2024. The threat of thousands of rockets pouring in from Lebanon or Gaza was significantly reduced.
But the second factor the documents explicitly cite is a major political shift in the United States. The policy analyses point directly to Donald Trump's return to power in 2025 and his immediate reinstatement of a maximum pressure campaign.
The briefs argue that this political alignment provided Israel with a unique, perhaps fleeting, strategic window. The logic presented in these analyses is that with the proxy shields weakened and the executive branch in Washington fully supporting aggressive military action, it was the optimal moment to systematically dismantle the Iranian threat.
But our sources don't just present that rationale unchallenged. We also have a fierce counter-argument from historical analysts who claim that this exact strategy has a massive blind spot.
Yes, the historical overviews in the documents present a strong opposing view. They argue that the strategy of maximum pressure and direct foreign military intervention has a decades-long track record of backfiring in Iran. The literature points out that external pressure campaigns rarely collapse the regime. Instead, these reports claim that foreign aggression actually hardens Tehran's resilience by fueling a deeply ingrained sense of nationalist unity.
And the historians point to very specific historical memories that drive this reaction, right?
Yeah.
They specifically bring up the 1953 coup.
Exactly. The texts reference Operation Ajax, the 1953 coup orchestrated by U.S. and British intelligence that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. The analyses argue that this event is a foundational trauma in the Iranian national consciousness.
Therefore, when Western powers launch bombs or declare regime change, the historical literature suggests it doesn't cause the Iranian public to turn on their leaders. Instead, it triggers a defensive, nationalist reflex against foreign imperial interference. The argument presented here is that the regime's greatest strength during these 2026 strikes wasn't their military technology, but the domestic unity forged by the absence of a credible, non-foreign-backed alternative when the country is under attack.
So we have military analysts in the defense briefs claiming that direct strikes successfully degrade existential threats by physically destroying things like centrifuges and command structures. Meanwhile, geopolitical historians argue that such strikes actually ensure the long-term survival of the regime by fueling nationalist defiance and domestic unity.
This leaves us with a significant question. When assessing national security, does the physical destruction of an enemy's weapons capabilities outweigh the psychological unification of their populace? That is something for you, the listener, to weigh as we look at the fallout of these massive operations.
It's a profound tension. But to truly understand the forces driving these military decisions, especially the territorial realities on the ground, the academic sources insist we have to look past the military hardware and examine the foundational ideologies at play.
That is exactly where the source material gets incredibly fascinating. We have a whole stack of academic and historical analyses dissecting Zionism, because the documents make it clear that you cannot understand the strategic map of this conflict without understanding the belief systems drawing the borders.
The academic texts provide a critical distinction right away. They begin by defining political or secular Zionism. Founded by Theodor Herzl in 1897, the literature describes this primarily as a secular national liberation movement. It emerged as a direct reaction to severe European anti-Semitism and the pogroms of the late 19th century.
The stated goal, according to historical records, was creating a secure, democratic Jewish homeland where Jewish people could govern themselves and defend themselves.
But the texts highlight that this secular political definition is only one part of the equation. There is a highly influential faction detailed extensively in the documents known as religious Zionism. And the sources note that religious Zionism operates on a fundamentally different premise than Herzl's vision.
Right. According to the theological and academic texts provided, religious Zionism views the repossession and settlement of Eretz Yisrael, the biblical land of Israel, not merely as a political necessity or a security objective, but as a direct, non-negotiable divine commandment.
And the academic overviews point out a really interesting historical tension within the Jewish faith itself regarding this. They note that this proactive state-building ideology actually clashes with traditional, older rabbinic teachings.
The documents cite ultra-Orthodox groups, such as the Satmar Hasidim, who historically argued that Jewish people are bound by what the Talmud calls the three oaths. According to these texts, one of those oaths explicitly forbids forcing a mass return to the land through human or military effort before the miraculous arrival of the Messiah.
But religious Zionism, as outlined in the sources, flips that theology on its head. It posits that human action, political statecraft, military service, and active settlement is actually required to bring about the divine redemption. And this ideology ties directly into a concept mentioned across multiple policy briefs, the concept of Greater Israel.
Let's talk about Greater Israel, because the sources root this in very specific ancient texts. The historical and religious documents cite the biblical book of Genesis, specifically Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21.
These texts narrate a divine covenant where God promises the descendants of Abraham a specific tract of land. And the borders described in that text are massive. The text promises the land stretching from the river of Egypt, often interpreted as the Nile, all the way to the great river, the Euphrates, which is in modern-day Iraq.
Now, the policy briefs acknowledge that a modern state stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates is widely viewed by international observers as a radical or fringe notion. However, the underlying theology that there is an exclusive, divinely granted right to the entire biblical land is documented as having a profound influence on modern policy decisions.
It's not just an abstract idea discussed in seminaries. The documents show how this theology translates directly into tangible political frameworks. A prime example cited in the European policy briefs is the Decisive Plan.
According to the reports, the core tenets of this plan were essentially adopted by the Israeli coalition government in December 2022. The documents note that the coalition's foundational guiding principles explicitly stated the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all areas of the land of Israel.
The texts specifically name the West Bank, the Galilee, the Negev, and the Golan Heights.
The analyses argue that this specific ideological framework creates significant, unavoidable friction, not just with international bodies like the UN, but actively within U.S.-Israel diplomatic relations.
If we look at how the different factions analyze this, secular and Western policy perspectives tend to view the conflict through the lens of international law, UN resolutions, democratic values, and defensible security borders. But the religious Zionist perspective, as described in the sources, fundamentally rejects that framing.
The documents note that for adherents to this ideology, territorial possession is prioritized regardless of national security blowback, demographic challenges, or international condemnation. The texts point to prominent ideological leaders to illustrate this.
Figures such as Rabbi Dov Lior are cited in the documents as advocating for policies which include the annexation of contested territories and the removal of Palestinian populations based entirely on these religious imperatives.
To this worldview, the land is holy, its borders are divinely mandated, and surrendering any part of it is not a political compromise. The texts state it is viewed as a violation of a covenant with God.
And the policy briefs warn that when state leaders merge this faith-based covenantal narrative with modern military statecraft, it fundamentally alters the strategic calculus of the entire region. The diplomatic reports show that the international community views this approach as an expansionist agenda that guarantees perpetual regional instability.
Conversely, proponents of the ideology view it as faithfully fulfilling a religious destiny against all odds. Here we have a profound, irreconcilable tension presented by our sources. International relations experts and legal frameworks claim that modern borders must be desacralized and negotiated to maintain global order. Meanwhile, religious authorities claim that specific territories are bound by immutable, divine covenants that supersede human diplomacy.
Which raises an important question. When the modern international system's secular rules conflict with deeply held theological mandates, which framework ultimately dictates state behavior, we invite you to consider how these opposing forces interact, especially when those holding the theological views are making the military decisions.
And that tension brings us to perhaps the most unique part of our source stack today, because the documents don't just examine the theology driving Israeli territorial policy. We have theological commentaries, transcripts from religious scholars, and analyses of ancient texts that look at the broader regional conflict itself, the missiles flying between Tehran and Tel Aviv, and interpret them through a deeply prophetic lens.
Yes, the theological commentaries provided in the materials look at the wars of 2025 and 2026 and claim they are witnessing the fulfillment of ancient Jewish prophecy playing out on live television. Specifically, they're pointing to a conflict known in biblical texts as the War of Gog and Magog.
For those unfamiliar, the sources detail this prophecy as originating from the biblical book of Ezekiel, specifically chapters 38 and 39. According to the commentaries, Ezekiel describes a massive apocalyptic coalition of nations forming to attack Israel in the end of days.
But what is truly fascinating here is how modern religious figures cited in our sources are explicitly identifying the players mentioned in this ancient text.
They are drawing direct lines from the ancient scrolls to the modern geopolitical map. The commentaries explicitly identify Persia, which is the historical name for modern-day Iran, as the key instigator in this apocalyptic coalition.
The sources cite historical sages to back this up. For instance, they reference the Malbim, a very prominent 19th century biblical commentator, long before the modern state of Israel existed, and long before the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The documents show the Malbim predicted, based on his reading of Ezekiel, that the final apocalyptic war would involve Persia leading a coalition of nations against the West and Israel.
And modern religious figures are taking that interpretation and applying it directly to the events we just discussed. The documents cite scholars like Rabbi Tovia Singer and Rabbi Jason Sobel, who are actively teaching that the current U.S.-Israel war with Iran is the literal manifestation of Ezekiel's prophecy.
Rabbi Tovia Singer's commentary in the sources highlights what he views as a massive historical anomaly that proves the prophecy. He points out that historically, the ancient Persian Empire was actually incredibly benign, even benevolent, toward the Jewish people.
The historical records note that it was the Persian king Cyrus the Great who ended the Babylonian exile and facilitated the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
So the argument is that, historically speaking, the Jewish people and the Persians were allies.
Exactly. Singer argues that there was absolutely no logical historical reason for the ancient prophets like Ezekiel to pinpoint Persia as the ultimate existential enemy of Israel at the end of days. Therefore, the fact that modern Iran has aggressively assumed this exact role, funding proxies, building nuclear infrastructure, launching ballistic missiles, is seen by these theologians as striking, miraculous proof of the prophecy's divine accuracy.
The details they pull from the ancient texts to match the current military events are incredibly specific. Let's look at the Talmudic references in the stack. The commentaries cite a tradition from the Talmud, specifically Tractate Yoma, page 10a.
The text states, "If you see Persia falling into the hands of the West, expect the footsteps of the Messiah."
Let's contextualize how explosive that interpretation is right now based on our sources. We just discussed Operation Epic Fury in 2026, where U.S. and Israeli forces utilized stealth bombers and cruise missiles explicitly aimed at regime change in Tehran.
To a secular military analyst, that is a strategy of geopolitical containment. But to religious observers reading Yom Tenai, seeing Western military forces actively trying to topple the Persian regime is seen as this exact Talmudic scenario playing out in real time, signaling the imminent arrival of the Messianic era.
And the sources draw massive symbolism from the timing of these military actions as well. The documents note that the massive June 2025 strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, Operation Rising Lion, coincided precisely with the Hebrew month of Odar, and specifically the Jewish holiday of Purim.
The religious commentaries make a massive point of this coincidence. The texts explain Purim is the holiday that literally celebrates the deliverance of the Jewish people from an ancient Persian official named Haman.
According to the Book of Esther, Haman served King Ahasuerus, often identified as Xerxes I, and plotted to completely annihilate the Jewish population of the Persian Empire. The sources show modern rabbis drawing direct, explicit parallels between the biblical villain Haman and modern Iranian leadership, framing the 2025 bunker buster strikes as history repeating itself by divine design.
Furthermore, the text suggests that the trigger for this entire apocalyptic sequence was the establishment of the State of Israel itself. The commentaries point out that Ezekiel's prophecy explicitly notes the attack will come against a land whose people are gathered from many peoples to the mountains of Israel.
The theological argument presented here is that the global dispersion of the Jewish people paused the prophetic clock, and their return to the land restarted it.
To those viewing the war through this prophetic lens, the events of 2025 and 2026 are not merely battles over uranium enrichment levels or regional hegemony or securing the Strait of Hormuz. They claim these events are the inevitable, unstoppable unfolding of a divine script that has been waiting over 2 millennia to activate.
And it is vital to point out that our sources show this heavy theological framing is not exclusive to one side of the conflict. The academic documents note the deeply entrenched Islamic perspective as well. They cite historical precedents for how conflicts in this region are often elevated to cosmic struggles.
For instance, the text referenced Saddam Hussein's 1990 framing of the Gulf conflict, not as a dispute over Kuwaiti oil, but as a battle of faith versus infidelity, framing secular political conflicts in absolute religious terms.
Similarly, the foreign policy analyses note that Iran's foundational stance since 1979 is deeply rooted in a theological pan-Islamic solidarity. The literature claims that the Iranian clerical leadership views opposition to the State of Israel not merely as a geopolitical strategy to project power, but through a strictly religious and moral lens, viewing the existence of Israel as an affront to Islamic sovereignty in the region.
So we see geopolitical strategists in the policy briefs explaining this war as a material struggle for regional hegemony, military deterrence, and resource control. Meanwhile, theological commentators interpret the exact same events, the bombings, the missile salvos, the regime changes, as the inevitable unfolding of ancient prophecies leading to a messianic era.
This leaves us with a fascinating tension. Do the material realities of geopolitics and military friction naturally drive populations toward religious fervor, or do these deeply ingrained, centuries-old prophetic narratives actually steer the geopolitical decisions of modern nations? That is a complex dynamic for you, the listener, to ponder as you watch these events unfold.
It forces us to ask what is really at the wheel, the politicians or the prophets? But to ground this back in the immediate material realities, the documents insist we look at the global economic fallout. Because while the ideological and prophetic battles are profound, the practical consequences are playing out on the global chessboard right now.
Right. Let's look at the economic data in the reports.
Right.
When the U.S. and Israel launched the 2026 strikes aimed at regime change, the economic shockwaves were instantaneous. The financial reports in our stack show that following President Trump's public demands for Iran's unconditional surrender, global oil prices soared by over 10% in a single trading day.
And that price spike is tied directly to physical geography. The geopolitical briefs detail the strategic nightmare that is the Strait of Hormuz. For context, the strait is an incredibly narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. The documents note that no less than 20% of the world's entire global oil supply passes through this single choke point.
To put that in perspective, that's roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day. If you choke that off, the global economy starts gasping for air almost immediately.
Exactly. And with Iranian forces retaliating against Gulf infrastructure and U.S. Navy assets in the region, the maritime insurance markets panicked. Commercial shipping companies refused to send tankers into an active war zone, meaning the strait effectively faced closure.
The financial analyses note that the moment you restrict a fifth of the global energy supply, inflation ripples across the globe, impacting everything from manufacturing to the cost of groceries.
And the nations geographically situated around that choke point found themselves in an impossible position. The policy briefs detail how the Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain were completely caught in the crossfire.
The reports note that these GCC states desperately attempted to maintain neutrality and begged for de-escalation. But their geographical reality, specifically their hosting of massive U.S. military bases, made them unavoidable targets in Iran's retaliation strategy.
The battle damage reports confirm the terror of this spillover. They document that Iranian ballistic missiles didn't just hit the military air bases in these countries. The reports claim missiles struck luxury hotels, financial districts, and residential buildings in places like Dubai and Bahrain.
The illusion that a war between Israel, the U.S., and Iran could be neatly contained was violently shattered, proving that regional infrastructure was highly vulnerable. This massive economic and regional disruption brings us to a highly polarizing debate within the strategic realpolitik reports found in our sources, the theory of who benefits from this controlled chaos.
It's a crucial debate in the literature. Let's look at the first perspective presented. One analytical viewpoint claims that, despite the immediate shock to the oil markets, the United States and Israel are the definitive long-term beneficiaries of this conflict.
Walk us through the logic of that claim in the documents. How does creating a massive war in the Middle East benefit Washington and Jerusalem?
According to this realpolitik analysis, the war provides the necessary cover for the U.S. and Israel to systematically and violently neutralize uncooperative regional actors. The briefs argue that by severely degrading Iran's command and control capabilities, physically destroying their nuclear sites, and severely weakening the proxy network of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, the U.S. and Israel are forcibly reshaping the balance of power.
Furthermore, some analysts in the stack suggest that by sidelining a major adversary like Iran, this provides the United States with tighter indirect control over the global flow of energy in the region, cementing Western geopolitical dominance in the Middle East for the next generation. It's framed as a painful but necessary surgery to remove a strategic tumor.
But, as is the pattern in our sources, there is a starkly contrasting view. Other extensive analyses in the stack argue that this conflict is an absolute economic and strategic catastrophe for the West, and that the surgery might kill the patient.
Yes, the counter perspective claims the costs far outweigh any theoretical benefits. Let's start with the military cost. The documents cite CNN defense reports indicating that the United States depleted roughly a quarter of its entire global stockpile of high-end missile interceptors just during the June 2025 exchanges.
A quarter of the global stockpile, just to intercept one wave of retaliatory strikes. That is what the reports claim. And the strategic priests note that this raises severe, immediate concerns about the sustainability of Israel's air defense umbrella, and more broadly, about U.S. military readiness across the globe. You cannot replace billions of dollars of sophisticated interceptors overnight.
And the economic cost extends far beyond the price of oil at the pump. The financial sources note severe global inflation fears driven by the instability. They explicitly point to countries like Turkey, which the documents claim faced massive destabilizing economic strain due to the disruption in regional trade and energy costs.
Strategically, these reports argue the war is isolating Israel internationally, straining its diplomatic ties, and deeply fracturing its domestic political cohesion. Furthermore, the geopolitical briefs argue that this massive focus on the Middle East is pulling crucial Western military bandwidth, financial resources, and political capital away from other critical global fronts, specifically noting the war in Ukraine.
And perhaps most concerning for Western analysts in the stack, the documents report that rather than isolating Iran globally, the conflict has actually accelerated Iran's integration with strategic competitors like China and Russia. In fact, there is a Washington Post report included in our materials that makes a staggering claim. It states that Russia is now actively providing Iran with exquisite intelligence, including the specific, real-time targeting locations of U.S. warships and military aircraft in the region.
That detail fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. It suggests the war is not just a regional dispute, but a proxy battleground for a larger superpower confrontation.
So, we are presented with economic and strategic analysts who claim that this conflict severely destabilizes the global economy, dangerously depletes Western military readiness, distracts from other global crises, and isolates the U.S. and Israel while strengthening a Russian-Iranian alliance.
On the other hand, realpolitik strategists argue that this immense disruption is a necessary beneficial step to neutralize an existential nuclear threat and secure long-term Western geopolitical dominance in the region.
This brings up a critical question. In the calculus of global power, does the theoretical long-term reshaping of political influence justify the immediate, undeniable economic and humanitarian destruction? We leave that for you to weigh.
It is a phenomenal amount of information to process, and the tension between these perspectives is what makes understanding this conflict so incredibly difficult.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We want to remind you why untangling these incredibly dense sources matters, because whether you are watching gas prices fluctuate at your local station, reading about global military deployments and depleted missile stockpiles, or trying to understand the intense, often religiously charged rhetoric on the evening news, the layers of this conflict are entirely interconnected.
From the price of a barrel of oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz, to the sophisticated engineering of a uranium centrifuge in Natanz, to the ancient apocalyptic texts of Genesis and Ezekiel, these forces are actively, dynamically shaping the world you live in today.
As we wrap up, I want to invite you to consider a final synthesis based on a very specific detail found in the battle damage assessments in our source documents.
The reports note that the massive, unprecedented military strikes of June 2025 operations that utilized the absolute most advanced weaponry in the U.S. and Israeli arsenals, including stealth bombers and bunker busters, only managed to set Iran's nuclear program back by an estimated 1 to 2 years.
1 to 2 years. All of that escalation, the shattered deterrence, the economic shockwaves, for a brief pause.
Exactly. The reports claim that if the most advanced, concentrated military operations on Earth only by a temporary 1 to 2 year pause, it forces us to wonder. Can true, lasting security ever be achieved through a cycle of preemptive physical destruction? Or does the very act of trying to forcefully eliminate a threat guarantee that the threat will continually rebuild itself with even greater resolve and deeper domestic unity?
That is a profound paradox for you to mull over as you explore these complex issues further. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring this landscape of information. We appreciate you taking the time to go on this deep dive with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.